The first ship came out of the dark near the edge of the Kepler belt, and it did not ask permission to be there. It was long and black, shaped like a blade, and it moved without any of the courtesy signals that human ships used when entering a system that was not their own. Sensors on the mining station Halcyon picked it up 11 minutes before it would have been visible to the naked eye, and by then it was already slowing down, already turning its nose toward the station like a predator that had smelled blood. Station Commander Elena Reyes was drinking her third coffee of the shift when the alert came through. She did not spill it. She had trained for this moment for 6 years, ever since the Outer Rim Treaty had been signed and every human station commander in deep space had been given the same warning. Something is out there, and one day it will find us. Report, she said, setting the cup down with more control than she felt. Unknown vessel, ma'am. Not in any registry. Length approximately 800 meters. No response to hailing on any frequency. The sensor officer's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Keep hailing. Peaceful protocol. Full lights, no weapons armed. Reyes said this without hesitation, because it was the law, and because she believed in it. Humanity had made a promise to itself after the wars of the 22nd century, after the near destruction of Earth's biosphere, after the long, slow years of rebuilding. Never again would humans reach for a weapon first. Not unless there was no other choice left. The black ship did not answer the hails. Instead, it launched 3 smaller craft, insect-shaped things with too many limbs, and they landed on the station's outer hull without asking, cutting through the metal skin with beams of blue light. They're breaching, Commander. Seal every section aft of Deck 12. Get the civilians into the shelters. Nobody fires unless fired upon. That is still the order. Reyes's voice did not shake, though her hands were cold. What came through the breach was not what anyone expected. They were tall, nearly 9 feet, with skin like gray stone and 4 eyes set in a ridge across their heads. They did not speak. They simply began to kill anyone who stood in their path, moving through the corridors of Halcyon Station with the calm efficiency of something that had done this many times before. Reyes watched on the monitors as 12 of her people died in under 2 minutes. She watched the security teams, armed only with stun batons because lethal weapons were restricted on civilian stations, fall back, and fall back, and fall back. And still she did not give the order to use the station's defense turrets, because the defense turrets were meant for asteroids and debris, not for killing, and the rule was clear: restraint first, always, until restraint was no longer possible. It was Chief Engineer Marcus Webb who made the call that saved what was left of the station. He vented the atmosphere from the breached sections directly into space, sacrificing the hull integrity of 3 decks to expose the invaders to vacuum. The gray-skinned things did not seem to need to breathe the way humans did, not immediately, but the sudden decompression threw them off balance long enough for the remaining crew to seal the final door between the invaders and the shelter decks. Halcyon Station survived. 41 people did not. When the black ship finally withdrew, 3 hours later, it left behind a single message, broadcast in a crude approximation of Earth standard that had clearly been assembled from years of listening to human transmissions. The message was short. You are weak. You did not fight. Your kind will be easy. It was signed with a symbol that human linguists would later translate as the sigil of the Skorath Dominion, an empire that had, according to the fragments of data recovered from the wreck of one of the insect craft, already conquered 11 other species across 400 light-years of space. None of those species, it seemed, had put up much of a fight either. The news reached Earth 18 hours later, carried across the deep space relay network at the speed of light, which still felt painfully slow when people were dying at the far end of it. By the time the message arrived in the office of Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole, commander of the Terran Defense Fleet, the story had already changed 3 times as it passed through different hands, each retelling adding a little more fear and a little more anger. Cole read the raw sensor logs herself, not the summaries. She always read the raw data first. She was 52 years old, with gray at her temples and a scar along her jaw from a shuttle accident 20 years earlier, and she had spent her entire adult life preparing for a day she had hoped would never come. Humanity had built its defense fleet not because anyone wanted a war, but because history had taught every civilization that had ever existed the same lesson: the universe does not owe you safety. she called an emergency session of the Joint Defense Council within the hour. They tested us, she told the assembled officials, generals and diplomats gathered in the underground chamber beneath Geneva. Halcyon Station was not a real target. 41 dead is a tragedy, but it was not meant to cripple us. It was meant to measure us. They wanted to see what we would do when attacked without warning, and we showed them exactly what they wanted to see. We showed them a species that hesitates. With respect, Admiral, said Counselor Advika Rao, the head of the Civilian Oversight Committee, our restraint protocols exist for a reason. We do not know enough about the Skorath to risk full retaliation. We do not know their numbers, their territory, their true strength. I am not asking to retaliate, Cole said. Not yet. I am asking for something more dangerous than retaliation. I am asking for patience, and I am asking this council to trust that patience is not the same thing as weakness. She laid out her plan over the following 2 hours, and it was a plan built on decades of quiet preparation that most of the council had never fully understood until that moment. Humanity's public fleet, the ships that patrolled the trade lanes and defended the colonies, was real, but it was not the whole picture. For 30 years, in secret shipyards built into the asteroid belt and hidden beneath the ice of Europa, humanity had been building something else, a reserve fleet. A deterrent so powerful that no one had ever wanted to admit it existed, because the moment the galaxy knew humanity had teeth, humanity would also become a target for every fearful species that assumed a threat must be destroyed before it could grow. We do not show them the reserve fleet, Cole said. Not yet. First we show them mercy. We give them exactly the warning that the treaties of old Earth would have given any nation before a war. We tell them, clearly, in words they cannot misunderstand, that further aggression will have consequences. We give them the chance to walk away. Most species, when given a real warning backed by visible strength, choose to walk away. And if they do not? Asked General Okonkwo Adeyemi, commander of Earth's ground forces. Cole's expression did not change. Then we stop being merciful. The council debated for 6 more hours before approving her plan, and even then, it passed only by a narrow margin, with several members arguing that any warning at all was an unnecessary risk, that humanity should either attack now with everything it had, or retreat entirely and fortify Earth alone. Cole held her ground. She believed, the way her mother and grandmother had taught her to believe, that a civilization was measured not by how much destruction it could deliver, but by how long it was willing to wait before delivering it. The message that went out to the Skorath Dominion 3 days later was broadcast on every frequency human science could identify as being used by their ships, repeated in a dozen translated dialects assembled by the same linguists who had decoded the Skorath's own crude warning. It was short, and it was deliberately calm. We are the people of Earth. You attacked a civilian station without cause and killed 41 of our people. We did not retaliate, though we could have. This was not weakness. This was our choice. We are giving you one warning. If you attack us again, we will respond with the full strength of our fleet, and you will not enjoy what you find. Withdraw from our systems. This is your only warning. For 9 days, there was silence. Human colonies across the outer systems went on high alert. Defense grids were quietly reinforced, and civilian ships were rerouted away from the border regions near Skorath-controlled space, wherever that space could be estimated to be. Sarah Cole slept 4 hours a night during those 9 days, and spent the rest of her time in the command center beneath Geneva, watching sensor feeds from a dozen systems, waiting. On the 10th day, the Skorath answered, not with words, with ships. A fleet of 40 vessels, larger and more heavily armed than the single scout that had attacked Halcyon, dropped out of the dark near the human colony of New Meridian, a farming world with a population of 200,000 people who had never seen a warship in their lives. The Skorath fleet did not send a message. It simply began firing on the orbital defense platforms, the same way it had cut through Halcyon Station's hull, with the calm confidence of a species that had never once, in 400 light-years of conquest, met an enemy that could truly hurt them. They had, Sarah Cole thought as the reports came in, mistaken her warning for a bluff. She stood from her chair in the command center, and for the first time in 9 days, she allowed herself something close to a smile. It was not a happy expression. It was the expression of someone who had hoped for peace and had just been given permission to stop hoping for it. "Sound the fleet recall," she said. "All reserve shipyards, full activation. Tell New Meridian to hold on. Tell them help is coming, and tell them exactly what kind of help." Somewhere above the ice of Europa, in shipyards that had never once been photographed by any satellite that was not owned by the Terran Defense Fleet, massive doors began to open. Ships that had been under construction for 3 decades, ships built from lessons learned in every human war and every simulated battle against an enemy that did not yet exist, began to power their engines for the first time. The warning had been clear. Humanity had shown its restraint. Now, for the first time in its short history among the stars, it was about to show something else. At New Meridian, the farming colonists huddled in shelters beneath their fields, watching the sky burn orange and red as the orbital platforms took hit after hit, and they did not yet know that 400 light-years away, in a place the Skorath called home, alarms were about to start ringing for a very different reason. They did not know that Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole had just given an order that would change the shape of the galaxy. They only knew that the sky was on fire, and that somewhere out past the edge of what they could see, something enormous was finally waking up. Grand Marshal Vex Thurak stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Devourer of Weak Stars, and watched New Meridian's defenses collapse with the same bored expression he wore during every conquest. He had commanded the Skorath Third Fleet for over 60 of his people's long years, and in that time he had broken 11 species without ever losing more than a handful of ships. Each conquest followed the same pattern. Find the weakest point, strike it hard, watch the enemy either surrender or die trying to save what they could not save. He had read the human warning 3 days earlier and laughed, a low rumbling sound that had unsettled even his own officers. "They think words can stop us," he said to his second-in-command, an officer named Krell, who stood a full head shorter than him but was no less dangerous. "A species that hesitated to defend one station now claims it will unleash its full strength against us. This is the same lie every weak species tells before it dies." Their scout reported minimal resistance at the mining station, Krell agreed. "Stunned weapons only. No lethal defense grid." "They are exactly what the pattern predicted." Thurak nodded, satisfied. The Skorath Dominion had grown across 400 light-years by following a simple doctrine passed down from conqueror to conqueror: test the target, measure its response, and strike before it can organize a true defense. Species that fought back immediately and without mercy were dangerous and had to be approached carefully. Species that hesitated, that talked about warnings and treaties and restraint, were always the easiest. They spent so much time deciding whether to fight that by the time they made up their minds, it was already too late. He gave the order to press the attack on New Meridian's surface, confident that within a day, the colony would either surrender or be reduced to rubble, and that either outcome would serve the same purpose. It would prove, once again, that the Skorath Dominion could not be stopped by a species too soft to strike first. He did not know, because his intelligence networks had never been able to penetrate deep enough into human space to find it, that the pattern he trusted so completely was about to break for the first time in 600 years of Skorath conquest. Beneath the ice of Europa, in a shipyard that existed on no public star chart and had never been mentioned in any diplomatic exchange, the doors of Bay 7 ground open on hinges the size of buildings. Inside, half hidden in shadow until the working lights snapped on one section at a time, sat the Terran Reserve Fleet. It had been built slowly, over 30 years, funded through budgets that most of Earth's population never knew existed, staffed by engineers and scientists who had signed away decades of their public lives in exchange for the chance to build something that might never be needed. Every ship in Bay 7 had been designed after the same hard lesson, learned from studying the wreckage of Halcyon Station's attackers, and from centuries of human military history before that. An enemy that has never seen your true strength cannot plan against it. The flagship of the reserve fleet was called the Second Chance, a name chosen deliberately by the engineers who built her, because that was what she represented. She was 3 kilometers long, built from an alloy that had taken 12 years to perfect, one that could shrug off weapons fire that would vaporize any Skorath hull in seconds. Her weapons systems had never been fired outside of simulation. Today that would change. Admiral Cole boarded the Second Chance 40 minutes after giving the recall order, moving through corridors lined with crew members who had trained for this moment for their entire careers, without ever truly believing it would come. Many of them looked frightened. She did not blame them. Fear was a reasonable response to what was coming, but she also saw something else in their faces as she passed, something steadier beneath the fear, a quiet readiness, the kind that comes from years of preparation finally meeting its purpose. She reached the command deck and took her seat, and the bridge crew turned to her, waiting. "New Meridian is under attack," she said. 200,000 civilians on the surface, 40 enemy ships in orbit. We gave them a warning, and they answered it with fire. That is the last mistake they get to make without consequence. She paused, looking at the faces around her, young and old, all of them carrying the weight of what was about to happen. "We did not build this fleet because we wanted a war. We built it because we understood that peace without strength behind it is just an invitation. Today, we stop being an invitation." She gave the order, and the Second Chance, along with 60 other ships that had waited in silence beneath the ice for 30 years, began to move. The Second Chance and her 60 escort ships crossed the distance to New Meridian in a way that no Skorath sensor system had ever recorded a human vessel moving before. The reserve fleet's engines used a drive system built on principles that Earth's public shipyards had never even attempted, folding the space in front of the hull rather than pushing through it the slow way. What should have taken the fleet 11 days to travel took them barely 6 hours. On the bridge of the Second Chance, Admiral Sarah Cole watched the counter tick down and thought about the 41 people who had died on Halcyon Station, and the unknown number who were already dying on the surface of New Meridian while she waited for her ship to arrive. She had given the Skorath a warning because it was the right thing to do, because humanity's laws demanded it, and because some quiet part of her had hoped, against all the evidence of history, that the warning alone would be enough. It had not been enough. Now she had to live with what came next, and she intended to make sure it was worth the cost. "Drop out of fold in 90 seconds, reported Commander Diego Alvarez, her tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man who had spent 15 years training crews for a battle he had never expected to actually fight. "Enemy fleet still in orbit around New Meridian. 42 vessels, ma'am. 2 more than our initial count." "Understood. All ships, weapons hot on my mark, but hold fire until I give the order," Cole said. "I want them to see us before we show them what we can do." That was the part of her plan that made her tactical staff the most nervous. Every simulation, every war game run over 30 years of planning had assumed that the reserve fleet's first engagement would be a surprise attack, hitting the enemy before they had any chance to prepare. But Cole had insisted on something different. She wanted the Skorath to see the Second Chance arrive. She wanted them to have a moment to understand exactly what they were facing, and a chance to stop. It was not weakness that drove this choice. It was something closer to a warning inside a warning, the last honest offer humanity intended to make before the fighting truly began. The fold drive released its grip on space, and 61 human warships appeared in the skies above New Meridian, in absolute silence, arranged in a formation that had been practiced 10,000 times in simulation and never once in reality. Grand Marshal Vex Thurak felt the tremor through the deck of the Devourer of Weak Stars before his sensor officer even finished the report, and for the first time in 60 years of conquest, something in his chest that he did not have a word for made him go still. "Report," he said, his voice flat. "Unknown contacts, 61 vessels, directly above the planet. They did not register on long-range scans, Grand Marshal. They simply appeared." Thurak turned to the view screen, and even his considerable experience could not stop the small shift in his posture as he took in the shape of the lead vessel. It was larger than his own flagship. Its hull carried none of the crude, function-first design of every human ship his fleet had catalogued before this moment. This was something else, something new. "Hail them," he said. "I want to know what this is." The channel opened, and Admiral Sarah Cole's voice came through, translated instantly by systems that had been quietly analyzing Skorath communication patterns since the very first attack on Halcyon Station. "Grand Marshal Vex Thurak," she said, and the use of his name and title sent a ripple of unease through his bridge crew, because it meant the humans had gathered more intelligence on the Skorath Dominion than anyone had believed possible. You were warned. We told you that further aggression would be met with our full strength. You chose to test that warning by attacking a civilian colony of 200,000 people. I am giving you one chance, right now, to withdraw your fleet from this system. If you take that chance, you and your crews will be permitted to leave. If you do not, you will not leave at all. Krell, standing at Thurok's side, made a low sound of disbelief. They offer mercy. After this display, they still offer mercy. Thurok studied the human ships on his view screen a moment longer, and something old and cautious in him, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 11 conquests, told him that this was not a bluff, but 60 years of doctrine, 60 years of watching weaker species crumble the moment real force was applied, was not so easily set aside. He had built his entire career, his entire understanding of the galaxy, on the belief that any species offering mercy after a show of strength was a species uncertain of its own power. Strength did not negotiate. Strength simply took what it wanted. Decline, he said. Target their lead vessel. All weapons. The order to fire went out across the Skorath fleet, and 42 ships turned their weapons toward the second chance in perfect unison, a display of coordination that would have been terrifying to any of the 11 species the Dominion had already conquered. Incoming fire, Admiral, Alvarez reported. All batteries. All 42 ships. Shields, Cole said simply. The second chance's shields, built from technology that had taken 3 separate research teams working in secret for over a decade to perfect, absorbed the combined firepower of an entire enemy fleet, without so much as a flicker on the bridge lighting. On the view screen, 42 beams of energy struck an invisible barrier around the ship and simply dispersed, harmless, into the surrounding vacuum. For 3 full seconds, there was silence on the Skorath flagship's bridge. Impossible, Krell whispered. Thurok said nothing. He watched the human ship sit unharmed in the wake of an attack that should have crippled it, and for the first time in 60 years, he felt something he had not felt since he was a young officer facing his first real battle. Doubt. Admiral, Alvarez said quietly. Orders? Cole looked at the tactical display, at the 42 Skorath ships still holding position, still committed to an attack that had already failed. She thought once more of Halcyon Station, of the 41 names on the memorial list that had already been assembled back on Earth, of the families on New Meridian who did not yet know if their homes still stood. She thought about restraint, and about how much restraint a species could reasonably be asked to hold before restraint itself became a kind of cruelty toward its own people. They had their chance, she said. Target their engine sections and weapons arrays only. I want as many of them disabled, not destroyed, as we can manage. We are not here to slaughter them. We are here to end this attack and make sure they never consider one again. Fire. The second chance and her 60 escorts opened fire, and the difference in what happened next compared to the earlier exchange could not have been more stark. Where Skorath weapons had washed harmlessly over human shields, human weapons cut through Skorath hulls, like the metal was little more than paper. Ship after ship in the enemy formation, lost engines, lost weapons batteries, spun helplessly out of formation as precise strikes disabled their ability to fight without destroying the vessels outright. It was not the kind of battle Thurok had ever imagined losing. It was not a battle at all, not in any sense he understood the word. It was a demonstration. Within 11 minutes, 31 of the 42 Skorath ships had been disabled. The remaining 11, including the Devourer of Weak Stars, attempted to flee toward the edge of the system, and Cole let most of them go. She had made her point. She did not need to make it twice in the same hour. Grand Marshal Thurok, she said over the open channel, as his flagship limped toward the system's edge with half its systems failing. Return to your dominion. Tell your leaders what you saw here. Tell them the warning was real, and tell them this was restraint. We disabled your ships. We did not destroy them. We could have destroyed all 42 in the time it took you to fire your first shot. Remember that, the next time you consider testing us again. On the surface of New Meridian, the fighting stopped the moment the orbital battle turned. The Skorath ground forces that had begun landing near the capital, expecting the same easy conquest that had worked 11 times before, found themselves suddenly without air support and without any clear path to reinforcement. Local militia forces, farmers and shopkeepers who had picked up weapons only hours earlier, managed to hold their ground long enough for the remaining Skorath landing parties to receive the recall order from what was left of their fleet command. Governor Priya Anand, who had spent the entire battle in an underground shelter with 300 civilians, emerged into daylight 2 hours after the last Skorath ship left orbit to find her colony scarred but standing. 14 colonists had died in the ground fighting, and the Eastern Agricultural District had been badly damaged by orbital fire before the human fleet arrived. But New Meridian had not fallen. It was the first time in the Skorath Dominion's 400 years of expansion that a target species had not fallen. Word of what had happened above New Meridian spread through human space within hours, and then, more slowly, more uncertainly, it began to spread beyond human space as well. The Skorath were not the only species watching the border regions. Trade networks that stretched between a dozen different alien civilizations carried the story outward in fragments, exaggerated in some tellings, understated in others, but always carrying the same essential fact. A species that had once seemed weak had just humiliated one of the most feared conquerors in known space, and had done it while still, somehow, showing mercy. Back on the Second Chance, Sarah Cole stood alone on the observation deck after the battle had ended, watching the stars, and allowed herself a single moment of exhaustion before the next set of decisions would demand her attention. She knew this was not over. She knew that Vex Thurak was, even now, carrying his humiliation back toward the heart of the Skorath Dominion, and that a wounded predator rarely responded to a lesson with wisdom. It far more often responded with rage. She was right to worry. 400 light-years away, in a capital city built into the bones of a dead volcano, the leaders of the Skorath Dominion were about to receive Thurak's report, and their response would not be measured. It would not be restrained. It would be everything Sarah Cole had feared since the moment she first read the sensor logs from Halcyon Station, and it would arrive at human space with a force that made the first attack look like nothing at all. The Skorath High Council met in a chamber carved from black volcanic stone, a room built centuries earlier to remind every leader who entered it of the Dominion's origins as a people who had survived the death of their own homeworld by taking what they needed from others. 9 counselors sat in judgment as Vex Thurak stood before them, stripped of his usual confidence, describing a battle that none of them wanted to believe had happened. "You are telling us," said Counselor Rask, the eldest of the 9, and the one whose word carried the most weight, that a single human vessel absorbed the combined fire of 42 of our warships without damage. "I am telling you what I witnessed," Thurak said. "Their weapons cut through our hulls, as though our armor did not exist, and when they had won, they chose not to destroy us. They disabled us. They let most of us go. This was not an accident of battle, Counselor. This was a demonstration of choice." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some demanding immediate and overwhelming retaliation, others urging caution, a word that had rarely been spoken aloud in that chamber in living memory. It was Counselor Rask who finally restored silence, raising a single clawed hand. "In 400 years, Rask said slowly, we have never once encountered a species capable of this and unwilling to use it fully. This should trouble us more than any weapon they possess. A predator that shows mercy, while holding total power, is either wise beyond our understanding, or it is testing us the same way we test every world we conquer." He paused, and the silence in the chamber deepened. Either answer should give us pause. Instead, I already see in your faces that you intend to answer strength with fury, because fury is the only language this council has ever needed before. I fear that will be our mistake. Rask's warning was not enough. Within a day, the council had voted, overwhelmingly, to authorize the largest military mobilization in Skorath history, a full battle fleet numbering in the hundreds of ships, drawn from garrisons across their entire territory. Thurak, despite his defeat, was given command once more, not as a reward, but because the council believed that only he now understood, firsthand, what he was truly facing, and because pride demanded that the officer who had been humiliated be the one to deliver the Dominion's answer. News of the battle above New Meridian reached Earth 2 days later, filtered through official channels first and then, within hours, spilling out across every public network on the planet. For the first time since the founding of the Terran Defense Fleet, Ordinary people learned that a reserve fleet had existed in secret for 30 years, funded quietly through budgets they had never questioned closely enough to notice, built by tens of thousands of engineers who had kept the secret for the sake of a threat that had, until now, existed only in theory. The reaction was not simple relief. In the city squares of a dozen nations, people gathered to celebrate the survival of New Meridian's colonists. But there was also anger, sharp and immediate, from citizens who felt betrayed that such a fleet had been kept from public knowledge. Councillor Advika Rao, who had argued against even the initial warning message sent to the Skorath, found herself facing reporters outside the Geneva chamber only hours after the news broke. The people deserved to know what was being built in their name, she told the assembled cameras. Though privately she had already reviewed Admiral Cole's full report and understood, better than most, why the secrecy had mattered. A galaxy full of watching eyes, some friendly and many not, would have treated open knowledge of a fleet, like the Second Chance, very differently than they now treated the rumor of one. Sarah Cole, still aboard the Second Chance, as it made repairs following the battle, watched the public reaction from a distance and felt the particular loneliness that came with command. She had not built the reserve fleet to be celebrated. She had built it, alongside thousands of others who would never receive public recognition, because she had studied enough history to know that peace, unsupported by strength, was not peace at all, only a pause before the next disaster. She sent a single message back to Earth before turning her attention to the reports coming in from her intelligence officers about unusual activity detected near the edge of Skorath territory, activity that suggested the Dominion was not preparing to accept its first defeat quietly. "Tell the people of New Meridian we are proud of how they held their ground," her message read. "Tell the people of Earth that the choice to build this fleet in silence was never about hiding from them. It was about making sure that when the day came to use it, our enemies would never see it coming until it was already too late for them to prepare. That day has come. I do not believe it is finished." She was not wrong. Even as her message reached Earth, sensor stations along the border of human space began registering the first faint signs of a fleet larger than anything the Skorath Dominion had ever assembled in one place, gathering in the dark beyond the reach of any scout, preparing to answer New Meridian in a way that would leave no room, this time, for restraint on either side. 3 weeks passed after the battle above New Meridian, and in that time, human intelligence networks watched the gathering Skorath fleet grow from a rumor into an undeniable, terrifying fact. Long-range sensor arrays, hidden deep in the asteroid fields along the border, counted ship after ship arriving at a staging point just outside human territory, until the final tally stood at 312 vessels, more than 7 times the size of the force that had attacked New Meridian. This was not a punitive strike. This was an invasion. Admiral Sarah Cole studied the sensor data in the command center beneath Geneva, joined now by the full Joint Defense Council, all of whom had abandoned their earlier objections to the reserve fleet the moment they understood the scale of what was coming. 312 ships, General Adeyemi said, staring at the projection. "Admiral, how many ships do we have ready?" 94, Cole said. "The Second Chance and her 60 escorts, plus 33 additional vessels brought online from the remaining reserve shipyards over the past 3 weeks. We do not have parity in numbers. We never will, not against an empire that has been conquering worlds for 4 centuries. Then how do we win this?" Councillor Rao asked, and for once there was no argument in her voice, only genuine fear. Cole did not answer immediately. She had spent 3 weeks running simulations, wargaming every possible approach to a fight her side could not win through numbers alone, and she had arrived at a strategy that unsettled even her, because it required something harder than firepower. It required knowing exactly where the enemy would strike, and being willing to let them believe, for a short time, that their strike was working. "We do not fight them ship for ship across an open field," she said finally. "If we do that, our shield technology and weapons superiority will cost them dearly. But numbers alone will eventually overwhelm us. 94 ships cannot hold a line against 312 forever, no matter how much better each of ours is. Instead, we let them choose their target, and we make sure that target is a trap." Her plan centered on the colony of Meridian's Rest, a smaller agricultural world 2 systems away from New Meridian That intelligence suggested the Skorath fleet was most likely to strike first, both because of its proximity to their staging point and because Grand Marshal Thurak, still in command despite his defeat, would want to prove himself by striking somewhere close to the site of his humiliation. Cole intended to evacuate the colony almost entirely, leaving behind only a skeleton population protected by hardened shelters, while the bulk of her fleet waited hidden in the debris field of a long-dead moon on the system's edge. "We let them land," she said. "We let them believe Meridian's rest is undefended, the way New Meridian appeared undefended before we arrived, and when their fleet commits to orbit, spread out and vulnerable while their ground forces disembark, we close the trap." It was, several council members pointed out, an enormous gamble. If Thurak split his forces differently than predicted, or if he grew cautious after his earlier defeat and refused to commit his full fleet to a single target, the plan would collapse, and Meridian's rest would be left exposed with only a fraction of its usual defenses. Cole acknowledged the risk without flinching from it. "Every plan against an enemy of this size carries risk," she said. "I have studied Grand Marshal Thurak's record across 11 prior conquests. He is proud, and pride does not become more cautious after a single defeat. It becomes more desperate to prove itself. I believe he will come for us the same way he came for New Meridian, only now with enough force that he believes failure is impossible. That belief is the weapon we are going to use against him." The council approved the plan, though not without dissent, and the evacuation of Meridian's rest began within hours. 40,000 colonists were moved in a carefully staged operation, designed to look, from the perspective of any watching Skorath scout, like ordinary civilian traffic rather than a full evacuation. Only 1,200 volunteers remained on the surface, all of them trained defense personnel who understood exactly what role they were being asked to play. Grand Marshal Vex Thurak approached the human border 3 weeks after his defeat, with a fleet 312 ships strong, and a mind that had not stopped replaying the battle above New Meridian since the moment it ended. He had told himself, in the long nights since his humiliation, that the human victory had been a trick of technology, a single powerful vessel supported by lesser ships, and that overwhelming numbers would erase any advantage a handful of superior weapons could provide. He needed to believe this, because the alternative, that his entire understanding of conquest was flawed, was not something 60 years of doctrine allowed him to accept easily. His scouts identified Meridian's rest as the most lightly defended target within reach, exactly as Sarah Cole had predicted, and Thurak felt something close to relief when the reports came back showing minimal orbital defenses and no sign of the massive reserve fleet that had humiliated him weeks earlier. "They have not recovered," Krell said, studying the same reports, "or they have spread themselves too thin defending too many worlds at once. Either way, this is our opportunity," Thurak said. "We take this world completely, Grand Marshal to Farmer, and we send a message of our own. No more warnings. No more mercy shown in return for mercy. We show them what 400 years of conquest actually looks like when it is not held back." He committed the full fleet to the assault, exactly as Cole had gambled he would, and 312 Skorath warships descended toward Meridian's rest, in a formation built for total domination rather than caution, confident that whatever defenses remained would fall in hours, not days. From within the debris field of the dead moon at the system's edge, Sarah Cole watched the Skorath fleet spread into orbit around Meridian's rest, and felt the particular stillness that came before every difficult decision she had ever made in her career. 94 human ships waited in silence, engines cold, weapons powered down to avoid detection, while 312 enemy vessels positioned themselves exactly where her simulations had predicted they would. "They're launching landing craft," Alvarez reported quietly. "Ground forces beginning descent toward the capital." Cole watched the tactical display, watched the small green icons representing the 1,200 defenders on the surface begin their carefully rehearsed retreat toward hardened shelters, drawing the Skorath landing forces deeper into positions that had been prepared for exactly this purpose. Every minute the Skorath fleet remained in its current spread formation, focused on the ground assault and unaware of the danger gathering behind the dead moon, was a minute working in humanity's favor. "They're committed," Alvarez said finally. "Full fleet in orbit, ground forces engaged on the surface. This is the moment, Admiral." Cole thought of the 1,200 volunteers below, trusting her plan with their lives, and of the 3 weeks of preparation that had brought both fleets to this single point in space and time. She thought, too, of Vex Thurak, and of the strange respect she had developed for an enemy commander she had never met in person, one whose pride she had learned to predict with uncomfortable accuracy. "All ships," she said, "engines to full power. We are not here to punish them for existing. We are here to end an invasion before it costs a single life it does not have to cost. Move out." On the surface of Meridian's Rest, Captain Julia Ferreira led her 1,200 volunteers through the final stage of the retreat, falling back toward the reinforced shelters beneath the capital's grain silos, while Skorath ground troops advanced through streets that had been quietly emptied of everything except carefully placed sensor drones and decoy signals designed to make the retreat look like genuine panic rather than a rehearsed plan. She had trained for this operation for 3 weeks, ever since Admiral Cole's staff had briefed her personally on the role Meridian's Rest would play in the coming battle, and she had volunteered without hesitation, though she had not told her family the full truth of what she had agreed to do. The Skorath troops advancing through the capital moved with the same confidence Ferreira had read about in the reports from Halcyon Station, certain that resistance would collapse quickly, certain that this world, like every world before it in 400 years of Skorath history, would eventually bow. She let them believe it. Every building her people abandoned, every street they gave up without a real fight, pulled the invading force deeper into a city built specifically to slow them down, without ever revealing the true purpose of the delay. Narrow streets funneled Skorath patrols into positions where automated defenses, dormant and unremarkable to the naked eye, waited for a signal that had not yet come. Ferreira's task was not to win the ground battle. Her task was to survive it long enough for the real battle, the one happening far above her head, to change everything. "They're pushing toward the shelters," her second-in-command reported through her comm unit, voice tight with the particular fear of someone following a plan they trusted, but had never tested in real combat. "Estimate contact within 20 minutes. "Hold the line at the outer perimeter only," Ferreira answered. "We are not meant to defeat them here. We are meant to keep them occupied and keep them believing this world is theirs for the taking. The moment the fleet signal changes, we go dark and let the shelters seal. Everybody knows the plan. Trust it." Above her, though she could not yet see it, 94 human warships were completing the final stage of a maneuver that would determine whether her trust, and the trust of every colonist who had left their homeworld behind in a hurried evacuation 3 weeks earlier, had been well placed. The Skorath fleet, spread wide across Meridian's Rest orbit in a formation built for domination rather than defense, had grown so confident in the emptiness of the surrounding system that its sensor operators had grown careless, their attention fixed on the ground assault rather than the dead moon at the system's edge. It was exactly the mistake Sarah Cole had spent 3 weeks counting on. The 94 ships of the human fleet moved in absolute silence at first, engines running just below the threshold that Skorath sensors had been calibrated to detect, closing the distance across the system in a wide arc that would bring them around behind and beside the enemy formation, rather than in front of it, where any competent tactical officer would have expected an attack to come from. Cole had studied Skorath sensor technology recovered from the disabled ships at New Meridian for 3 weeks, and she had built her approach specifically around its blind spots. "Position achieved," Alvarez reported, his voice carefully steady, despite the tension visible in every line of his posture. "We have them surrounded on 3 axes, Admiral. They still have not detected us." Cole looked at the tactical display, at the neat green icons of 94 human ships arranged around the unsuspecting red mass of 312 Skorath vessels, and felt the full weight of what was about to happen settle onto her shoulders. This was not going to be a battle like the one above New Meridian, brief and almost bloodless by comparison. This was going to be the largest engagement in human military history, fought against an enemy that outnumbered her more than 3 to 1, and every decision she made in the next several minutes would determine how many of her people, and how many of the colonists trusting her plan on the surface below, would still be alive when it ended. "Grand Marshal Thurak," she said, opening a channel to the Skorath flagship one final time, her voice carrying across the system to a bridge that had no idea, until that exact moment, that it was no longer alone. You were given a chance to leave human space after New Meridian. You chose instead to bring your entire fleet against a colony of farmers. I do not intend to offer a third warning. 94 human warships emerged from the debris field of the dead moon in a formation designed for a single purpose: to encircle a fleet that outnumbered them more than 3-1. Before that fleet even understood it was no longer alone in the system. On the bridge of the Devourer of Weak Stars, Vex Thurak heard Sarah Cole's voice fill his command deck and felt something cold settle into his chest, a feeling he had not experienced since he was a very young officer facing his first true enemy. He turned toward his sensor operators, already knowing what they would tell him before they spoke. "Multiple contacts," his sensor officer said, voice cracking with a fear he could not fully hide. "They are everywhere, Grand Marshal. Above us, behind us, along both flanks. We did not detect them. We do not know how long they have been in position." Krell stepped closer to Thurak, his usual confidence gone entirely. "Orders, Grand Marshal?" Thurak stared at the tactical display, at the neat, patient formation of 94 ships that had somehow surrounded his entire fleet without triggering a single alarm, and understood, in that moment, that everything he had believed about this war was wrong. He had come here certain that numbers alone would erase whatever technological advantage the humans possessed. He had not considered that a species capable of building ships that could shrug off his entire fleet's firepower might also be capable of outthinking him completely, of turning his own confidence into the very trap that would destroy him. For the first time in 60 years of conquest, Vex Thurak did not know what to say. Behind him, on the surface of Meridian's Rest, his ground forces continued to advance through empty streets that had never truly been undefended at all, walking deeper into a trap that mirrored, in miniature, the one now closing around his entire fleet in orbit above. And far beneath the grain silos of the capital, Captain Julia Ferreira watched her instruments for the signal that would tell her the moment had finally come, ready to seal her people safely away from whatever was about to happen in the sky above them. The battle above Meridian's Rest began not with a wall of fire, but with silence, because Sarah Cole had built her entire plan around a single principle she had learned from 30 years of studying warfare across human history. An enemy that does not know where the next blow will land cannot properly defend against any blow at all. 94 human ships held their positions around the Skorath fleet for 11 long seconds after Vex Thurak's sensors finally detected them, giving his 312 vessels just enough time to understand the trap they had walked into before the first shot was fired. "Grand Marshal, orders," Krell said again, more urgently this time, as alarms began sounding across the Devourer of Weak Stars. Thurak's mind raced through every option available to him. A full retreat would mean abandoning his ground forces still fighting through the streets of Meridian's Rest, a humiliation that would end his career even if he survived it. A full assault against an enemy that had just proven, twice now, that its weapons technology far outstripped anything the Dominion possessed, carried its own obvious risk. But 60 years of doctrine did not simply disappear because a trap had closed around him, and some part of Thurak, the part that had built a career on refusing to be the commander who backed down, could not accept surrender as the first response. "All ships," he said, "concentrate fire on their flagship. If we destroy their largest vessel, the rest of their formation may falter. Full assault." It was, Sarah Cole would later reflect, exactly the decision she had hoped he would make. Concentrated fire against a single target was the most predictable response available to a cornered commander, and predictability, against a fleet holding every other advantage, was the most dangerous mistake an enemy could offer. "Incoming fire, concentrated on the second chance," Alvarez reported, watching as the tactical display lit up with the combined weapons fire of over 100 Skorath vessels converging on a single point. "Shields holding," came the report a moment later, and held again, as the second chance absorbed a barrage that would have annihilated any 3 ordinary warships in seconds. The shield technology developed in secret over 12 years of research did not merely deflect the attack, it endured it, second after second, while every human ship not caught in that concentrated fire turned its own weapons on the exposed flanks of the Skorath formation. "Return fire," Cole ordered. "Disable where you can. Destroy only where you must. We are not here to erase them from existence. We are here to end this. The battle that followed would be studied by military historians on Earth for generations, not because of its scale, though 312 enemy ships against 94 human vessels made it the largest engagement humanity had ever fought, but because of the strange, deliberate restraint that shaped every decision Sarah Cole made, even as the fighting grew fiercer. Where Skorath's ships fired to kill, aiming for hulls and crew compartments the way their doctrine had trained them to for 4 centuries, human ships continued targeting engines, weapon systems, and command sections, disabling rather than destroying wherever the tactical situation allowed it. It was not an easy restraint to maintain. Twice during the battle, Skorath weapons fire found gaps in human shield coverage, and 2 ships from the reserve fleet, the Meridian's Hope and the Second Wind, were lost with most of their crews, a cost that settled into Sarah Cole's chest like a physical weight, even as she continued issuing orders from the bridge of the Second Chance. She had known this battle would not be free of loss. Knowing it in advance did not make the reality of it any easier to carry. "Admiral, the Meridian's Hope is gone," Alvarez reported, his voice cracking for the first time since the battle began. 211 crew. Cole closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. No longer, because a longer pause was a luxury the battle did not allow her. "Understood. Continue the engagement. Concentrate fire on the vessels responsible, and disable their formation's eastern flank. We finish this as quickly as we can, for their sake and for ours." The tide of the battle turned gradually, rather than all at once, ship by ship, as the technological gap between the 2 fleets asserted itself despite the disparity in numbers. Skorath vessels, built for conquest against species that had never possessed anything close to human shield technology, found their weapons increasingly ineffective against an enemy that simply would not fall the way every previous target had fallen. Human ships, protected by shields that could absorb concentrated fire from dozens of enemy vessels at once, methodically worked through the Skorath formation, disabling engines and weapons arrays with a precision that came from 30 years of simulation finally meeting real combat. By the 90-minute mark, 180 of the 312 Skorath ships had been disabled or destroyed, and the remainder of the fleet, no longer holding any semblance of coordinated formation, began breaking away in scattered attempts to flee the system. Vex Thurak, aboard a flagship that had taken heavy damage but somehow remained functional, watched his once overwhelming force disintegrate around him, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the panic of the battle's opening minutes, that he had lost. Krell, still at his side despite a gash along his shoulder from a piece of shattered console, looked at his commander with an expression that mixed grief and something close to awe. "In 400 years, Grand Marshal, no fleet of ours has ever been broken this completely. Not by a species we once called primitive. We were never facing something primitive," Thurak said quietly, watching the tactical display continue to fill with the red icons of disabled or destroyed Skorath vessels. "We were facing a species that understood patience as a weapon, the way we have only ever understood force. We mistook their patience for weakness, because it was the only mistake our doctrine allowed us to make. I do not think the Dominion will survive making that same mistake twice." Far beyond the edge of the battle, near the staging point where the Skorath fleet had first gathered 3 weeks earlier, a single scout vessel that had been held in reserve broke away from the collapsing formation and began the long journey back toward the volcanic capital of the Skorath Dominion, carrying with it the first full account of a defeat unlike anything the Empire had suffered in 4 centuries of conquest. The 9 counselors who had voted to send the full Third Fleet against a handful of human colonies would not receive that report for several more days, and when they did, the chamber carved from black volcanic stone would fall into a silence deeper than any it had held before. Counselor Rask, who had warned against this very outcome before the fleet ever departed, did not say the words that hung unspoken in every mind present. He did not need to. The numbers alone said everything that needed saying. Of the 312 ships sent to punish a single agricultural colony, barely 60 remained capable of independent flight, and the Grand Marshal who had commanded them, a man with 60 years of unbroken conquest behind him, had surrendered rather than continue a fight the Dominion's own doctrine had told him was unwinnable to lose. "We built an empire on the certainty that no one could stand against us," Rask finally said, breaking the silence that had held the chamber for nearly a full minute. That certainty has just been proven false, in the most complete way possible. The question before this council now is not whether we retaliate again. It is whether we have the wisdom to understand that retaliation, a third time, may end the Skorath dominion entirely, rather than restore it. On the surface of Meridian's Rest, Captain Julia Ferreira received the signal she had been waiting for the moment the orbital battle's outcome became clear. A coded transmission from the Second Chance instructing all ground defense units to hold their final positions and prepare for the Skorath ground forces to receive their own withdrawal orders. She did not have to wait long. Within minutes of the signal reaching Meridian's Rest, the Skorath troops advancing through the capital's empty streets began receiving frantic recall orders from a fleet command structure that no longer had any ships left in position to extract them safely. What followed was not a battle, so much as a negotiated collapse. Skorath ground commanders, cut off from orbital support, and watching their transport craft scramble to reach the handful of remaining functional ships, found themselves facing a choice between fighting a defensive force they had underestimated from the very beginning, or attempting to reach evacuation points that might not survive to carry them away. Most chose evacuation. Ferreira's forces, following orders that had been drilled into them for 3 weeks, allowed clear paths to the remaining Skorath transports, rather than pressing an advantage that might have cost more lives on both sides than the situation required. "They're pulling back," her second-in-command reported, disbelief evident in his voice. "All units, Captain, they're retreating." Ferreira allowed herself a single breath of relief before responding. "Let them go. Our orders were to hold the world, not to punish every soldier who was sent here to take it from us. Confirm all shelters remain sealed until the all-clear from Fleet Command." Above her, the last organized resistance from the Skorath fleet collapsed, as Vex Thurak, watching barely 60 of his original 312 ships, still capable of independent flight, made the decision that would define the rest of his career and, though he did not yet know it, the rest of his life. "Signal the human flagship," he told Krell, his voice hollow with a defeat far deeper than the one he had suffered above New Meridian. "Tell them the Skorath Third Fleet surrenders." Sarah Cole received the surrender aboard the Second Chance, with none of the triumph that a decisive victory of this scale might have inspired in a different commander. She thought, instead of the Meridian's hope and the second wind, of the 400 and some crew members who would not be returning home, and of the 1,200 volunteers on the surface below who had trusted a plan built on the assumption that their world's emptiness could be turned into a weapon. "Order all remaining Skorath vessels to power down weapons and hold position," she said. "We take Grand Marshal Thurak into custody for negotiation, not as a prisoner of war in the sense his people might expect, but as the first step toward finding out whether this war can end here, or whether it is only beginning." She did not yet know which of those two outcomes waited for her, but she understood, standing on the bridge of a ship built for exactly this moment after 30 years of quiet preparation, that the answer would depend not on how thoroughly humanity had won this single battle, but on what humanity chose to do with a victory this large. The galaxy was watching now, in ways it had never watched before, and the next decision would matter more than any weapon in the Terran Reserve Fleet. Back on Earth, the news of the victory reached Geneva within hours, and this time there was no anger mixed into the public reaction, only a stunned, quiet disbelief that slowly gave way to something the planet had not felt in generations, the sense that humanity was no longer simply hoping to survive among the stars, but had, in a single afternoon, become a power that other civilizations would need to reckon with. Counselor Advika Rao watched the reports come in from her office, and found herself, for the first time since the crisis began, without a single argument left to make against the choices Sarah Cole had fought so hard to defend. 211 crew lost on the Meridian's Hope, 63 more on the Second Wind, she read aloud to her aide, the numbers heavier in her voice than any victory statistic could lighten. "We should remember that too, when the celebrations start. Every choice the Admiral made was still a choice that cost lives, even the ones we call restrained." Her aide, a young man who had joined her office only a year earlier, looked up from his own reports. "The Admiral disabled over 180 enemy ships without destroying most of their crews, Counselor. She could have killed every Skorath soldier in that fleet and called it justice for Halcyon Station. She didn't." Rao nodded slowly, thinking of the warning that had started this entire chain of events. A warning she had once argued against sending at all. No, she said. This she didn't. And I think that choice may end up mattering more than the battle itself, once the rest of the galaxy has time to understand what happened here. 400 light-years away, aboard a badly damaged flagship drifting under human escort toward a rendezvous point neither side had negotiated in advance, Vex Thurak stood at the viewport of his quarters and watched the stars, wondering what kind of reception awaited him back home, and wondering, with a mind still reeling from the scale of his defeat, whether the galaxy he had spent 60 years helping to conquer was about to change in ways the Skorath Dominion was not prepared to survive. Krell found him there sometime later, having been given permission by the human escort to move freely within the ship's damaged sections. He did not speak at first, simply standing beside his commander in the quiet way that long service together sometimes allowed. The crew is afraid, Grand Marshal. They do not know what happens now. Some believe the humans will execute us for what we did at Halcyon Station and New Meridian. Others believe worse. They will not execute us, Thurak said, with more certainty than he felt entitled to after everything the day had taught him. A species capable of disabling 300 vessels without needing to destroy most of them is not a species interested in slaughter for its own sake. Whatever Admiral Cole intends for us, I do not believe it is revenge. He paused, watching a distant human escort ship keep perfect pace alongside his own crippled vessel, close enough to finish the job in a heartbeat, and yet holding its fire with the same discipline it had shown throughout the entire battle. I only wish I had understood that sooner. It might have spared both our peoples a great deal of blood. 10 days after the battle above Meridian's Rest, a shuttle carrying Grand Marshal Vex Thurak descended toward a neutral space station, built specifically for this meeting. A joint construction project completed in less than a week by human engineers working alongside a small team of Skorath technicians, sent ahead under a fragile truce. The station orbited a star system that belonged to neither side, chosen deliberately by Sarah Cole's negotiating team because it represented, in its own small way, the kind of shared ground both civilizations would need to find if the meeting was going to matter at all. Thurak had expected, on some level he was not proud of, to be met with chains, or at the very least with the cold formality of a conquered enemy being paraded before its captor. Instead, Sarah Cole met him personally at the docking bay, without an honor guard, without any visible display of the overwhelming force that had ended his fleet 10 days earlier. She simply extended her hand, a human gesture he had studied, but never expected to be offered. Grand Marshal Thurak, she said, thank you for coming. You make it sound as though I had a choice, Admiral, he replied, though there was no real hostility in the words, only the tired honesty of a man who had spent 10 days confronting the collapse of everything he once believed. You did, Cole said. We released the surviving members of your fleet back to Skorath space 3 days ago, along with their disabled ships and enough supplies to make the journey home. You could have gone with them. You chose instead to come here and speak with me directly, on behalf of a council that has not yet decided whether it wants peace or a third war. That was a choice, and I think it was the right one. They walked together through corridors built jointly by two species that had, until 3 weeks earlier, known almost nothing about each other beyond the language of warfare, and Cole found herself explaining, plainly and without embellishment, the reasoning behind everything humanity had done since the attack on Halcyon Station. She did not frame it as triumph. She framed it as a series of choices, each one weighed against the cost of the alternative, made by people who had hoped, at every step, that the next choice would not be necessary. We built the reserve fleet because history taught us that peace without the ability to defend itself is not peace, she said, as they entered the station's central meeting chamber, a round room with windows looking out onto open space, deliberately designed to hold no advantage for either side. We gave your Dominion 2 warnings before we used it. We disabled far more of your ships than we destroyed, both times, because destruction was never our goal. It was only ever the last option, held in reserve, the same way the fleet itself was held in reserve, until every other option had failed. On Halcyon Station, now rebuilt with reinforced hull sections and a proper lethal defense grid installed for the first time in its history, Commander Elena Reyes stood in the same observation deck where she had watched 41 of her people die months earlier, and read the first reports of the ceasefire with an expression that mixed relief with something harder to name. Chief Engineer Marcus Webb, whose quick thinking with the station's atmosphere had saved what remained of the crew that day, joined her at the viewport without a word, and the two of them stood together in silence, thinking of the names now etched into the memorial wall behind them. "They're calling it a great victory back on Earth," Webb said eventually. "It was a victory," Reyes said, "but I don't think anyone who was actually there that first day will ever call it great. I think that's probably the right way to remember it." She looked out at the stars, at the quiet, ordinary traffic of mining ships that had slowly returned to Halcyon's orbit over the past months. 41 people paid for the lesson everyone else got to learn from a distance. I'd rather we remember the cost than the glory. The negotiations that followed lasted 6 days, longer than either side had initially expected, complicated by the fact that the Skorath High Council remained deeply divided over how to respond to a defeat unlike anything in 400 years of their history. Councillor Rask, whose earlier warnings had gone unheeded before the disastrous assault on Meridian's Rest, argued forcefully for accepting whatever terms the humans offered, believing that the alternative, a continuation of hostilities against an enemy who had just demonstrated total technological superiority, would end not in victory, but in the Dominion's slow destruction. Other councillors were not so easily convinced. 400 years of unbroken conquest had shaped Skorath culture around the assumption that strength alone determined the natural order of the galaxy, and the idea of negotiating as equals with a species they had, only weeks earlier, dismissed as an easy target, proved difficult for some of them to accept, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. It was Vex Thurok himself, speaking to the full council through a secure channel from the neutral station, who finally shifted the balance of the debate. He described, in detail that left no room for doubt, exactly what he had witnessed. Shields that absorbed the combined firepower of an entire fleet without failing, weapons that disabled Skorath vessels with surgical precision rather than indiscriminate destruction, and a human commander who had shown mercy not once but twice, even after being given every justification to show none at all. "We have spent 4 centuries believing that mercy is a sign of weakness," he told the council. "I believed this as completely as any of you, until I watched a species with the power to erase my entire fleet choose, instead, to spare most of the crews aboard it. That is not the behavior of a weak civilization, councillors. It is the behavior of one that understands something about strength that we have never allowed ourselves to consider. That true power does not need to prove itself through destruction. It only needs to be present and to be understood." He paused, letting the silence in the chamber stretch. "I recommend, in the strongest terms I have ever used before this council, that we accept whatever terms the humans are willing to offer, and that we begin, for the first time in our history, learning how to build something other than an empire built purely on conquest." The treaty that emerged from 6 days of negotiation was not a surrender in the way the Skorath Dominion had traditionally understood the word, and Sarah Cole had insisted from the very beginning that it not be framed that way. It established a firm border between human and Skorath territory, backed by a mutual defense agreement that neither side would cross without formal negotiation. It required the Dominion to release, without further conflict, any of the 11 previously conquered species that wished to seek independence, a clause that Councillor Rask himself had proposed, understanding better than most of his colleagues that a dominion built entirely on unwilling subjects was a dominion perpetually one crisis away from collapse. And it opened, for the first time in either civilization's history, a formal channel for trade and communication between two peoples who had begun their relationship with violence and were now being asked to imagine something entirely different. Not everyone on Earth agreed with the terms. Some argued that humanity, having demonstrated overwhelming military superiority, should have pressed its advantage further, extracting harsher concessions, or even pursuing the complete dismantling of the Skorath Dominion while the opportunity existed. Sarah Cole rejected this argument in a public address delivered from Geneva shortly after the treaty was signed, an address that would be studied and quoted for generations afterward. "We were attacked without warning, and we responded with restraint every step of the way, not because we lacked the strength to do otherwise, but because we understood something that our enemy did not. That strength used without limit becomes indistinguishable from the very cruelty it claims to oppose, she said, standing before a chamber that included representatives from every human nation, alongside the first Skorath diplomatic delegation ever to set foot on Earth. We showed the Skorath Dominion our restraint at Halcyon Station, and they mistook it for weakness. We showed them our power above New Meridian and Meridian's Rest, and they finally understood the difference. Now we have a choice to make, the same choice every civilization eventually faces once it has proven it can win. What do we build with the peace we have earned? I believe we build something better than what came before, for both our peoples. I believe we have already begun. 6 months later, the farming fields of New Meridian had been rebuilt, and the memorial listing 41 names from Halcyon Station stood alongside a second memorial honoring the crews of the Meridian's Hope and the Second Wind, a reminder that even a victory shaped by mercy still carried its own cost. Trade ships bearing both human and Skorath markings had begun moving cautiously along the new border, carrying goods and, more slowly, carrying understanding between two species that had nearly gone to war before they had even properly introduced themselves. Vex Thurak, stripped of his military command by a council eager to distance itself from the doctrine that had led to the Dominion's greatest defeat, chose instead to become the first Skorath ambassador to human space, a role that surprised no one more than himself. He spent his days now in meetings not unlike the ones that had once decided the fate of entire fleets. Except now the questions on the table were about trade routes and cultural exchange programs rather than battle formations, and he found, much to his own quiet astonishment, that he did not miss the conquest at all. Sarah Cole remained in command of the Terran Defense Fleet, though the reserve fleet that had once been the galaxy's best-kept secret was now, cautiously and deliberately, becoming public knowledge, a visible deterrent rather than a hidden one. She often thought back to the first message humanity had sent the Skorath Dominion, the warning that had gone unheeded and had led to so much loss before it was finally understood. She had meant every word of it then, and she believed it just as fully now, standing at the edge of a peace that felt more solid with every passing month. On Meridian's Rest, Captain Julia Ferreira had returned to civilian life once the immediate crisis passed, though she still met with Admiral Cole's staff twice a year to review the lessons learned from the ground defense that had helped turn the tide of the largest battle in human history. She often walked the rebuilt streets of the capital, past the grain silos where 1,200 volunteers had waited out the longest hours of their lives, and thought about how close the plan had come to failing, and how much had depended on ordinary people trusting a strategy they could not fully see the shape of while they were living inside it. "Do you ever regret volunteering?" a young reporter asked her once, during one of the rare interviews she agreed to give. "No," Ferreira said, without hesitation. "I regret that it was necessary. Those are different things. I hope my children never have to make the choice I made, but if they do, I hope they understand it the way I came to understand it, not as a chance for glory, but as a responsibility you carry, because someone has to, and because the alternative is worse." Far beyond the border between human and Skorath space, word of the treaty, and the battle that preceded it continued to spread along trade routes that stretched into regions neither civilization had ever mapped, carried by merchants and diplomats from a dozen other species who had spent centuries fearing the Skorath Dominion's steady expansion. Some of those species began, cautiously, to send their own envoys toward human space, curious about a civilization that had proven itself capable of overwhelming force, and had chosen, at every opportunity, not to use more of it than the moment required. It was the beginning of something that would take decades to fully understand, a slow, uncertain reshaping of the balance of power across that entire region of the galaxy, built not on humanity's ability to destroy, but on the harder, rarer thing it had shown instead, the discipline to hold its power in reserve, until reserve was no longer enough, and the wisdom to lay it down again the moment it was. The warning had been clear from the very beginning. Humanity had shown its restraint first, patiently, at real cost to itself, because that was the kind of civilization it wanted to be. Only when restraint had been tested and found wanting had it shown its power, and even then, it had shown only as much as was needed to end the threat, not one measure more. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the border between two star nations, carried outward along trade routes and diplomatic channels, to every civilization that had once watched the Skorath Dominion with fear, and now watched humanity instead with something closer to careful, curious respect. The galaxy had learned, in the span of a single season, that Earth's patience was not a weakness to be tested, and that its power, once finally unleashed, was tempered by a wisdom that made it more formidable, not less.